Not every old object is just decoration. Some carry dark stories, the kind that can change someone's life forever. In today's video, you'll hear terrifying stories of cursed objects that probably should have never been found. Like the story you're about to hear, where a mother brings home a bootleg DVD, not realizing that what's inside comes straight from hell. But before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any of our terrifying stories. And tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. Back then, I sold empanadas at a Sunday street market in Medellin right by San Antonio Park. It was just a little stand, but it put food on the table for me and my two kids. And every single week, without fail, Alejandro would set up his makeshift stall right in front of mine. Just a tarp and a table piled with bootleg DVDs. You could find anything there. Brand new movies still in theaters, telenovelas, music videos, and every now and then, some exclusive release nobody else had. Alejandro was friendly, chatted with everyone, but there was always something about him that set me on edge. A shifty way about him, like his jokes were too loud, his laugh too forced. He talked too much, too fast, and sometimes strange men would stop by his stall. Not regular customers. They never asked about prices, never browsed the movies, just leaned in, whispered a few words, and walked off with a DVD or two wrapped in brown paper. No cover. Alejandro would always change the subject when I asked what was so special about those unlabeled films. My kids, 8 and 10 at the time, loved stopping by to gawk at the colorful covers and ask if the new Spider-Man movie had arrived. And Alejandro, slick as ever, would always toss them a free disc. One of those gifts was where it all started. One morning after the market, my older son pulled a scratched-up DVD from his backpack. No cover, no label, just a battered silver surface. I asked where he'd gotten it, and he innocently said Alejandro had given it to him because it was a cool horror movie. But the cover was missing because it got messed up. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I tossed the disc in a drawer with the rest. But that night, when the kids begged to watch the horror movie, I caved. It was Saturday, and I figured it was probably just some cheesy zombie flick. We settled into the living room, turned off the lights, and hit play. What appeared on the screen wasn't a movie. The footage was shaky, like it had been shot on a phone or an old camcorder. A man with his face covered shoved someone bound and gagged into a dimly lit room. You could hear muffled whimpers, whispers, then screams. Real screams. The camera zoomed in on the victim's eyes, wide, desperate. What followed was pure horror. Cuts, mutilation, laughter in the background. My kids started crying, screaming, and I shut off the TV immediately. This wasn't a movie. It was real. A recording of a murder. I stood frozen for a few seconds, trying to process what I'd just seen. I hugged my kids and rushed them to their room. Tried to calm them down, but my daughter couldn't stop shaking. And me? I was drenched in cold sweat. I went back to the living room, grabbed the DVD, wrapped it in an old rag, and buried it in the back of a kitchen drawer. I didn't know what to do. Report it? Throw it away? What if it was some kind of threat? I spent the night wide awake, jumping at every sound, convinced someone was trying to break in through the window. It was like a shadow had slipped into the house with us that night. The next day, I went to the market early, before setting up my stand, and marched straight to Alejandro. He played dumb, laughed it off like it was some kind of joke. Said it must have been a too realistic movie and my kids had just gotten spooked. But his eyes were darting. It wasn't just the smug grin, it was the fear barely hidden when I said, I saw what was on that disc. That same day, I noticed 2 men I'd never seen before lurking around the market. One was bald, covered in neck tattoos. The other wore a cap pulled low. They didn't buy anything, just wandered, eyeing the stalls and staring at me. When their gaze locked onto me, I felt a chill run down my spine. I had to ask a friend to watch my stand while I left early with my kids. I wasn't taking any chances. This wasn't a coincidence. That night, I left every light in the house on, locked the doors, the windows, even the little gate in the backyard. But it didn't matter. Around 11, I heard heavy, sharp knocks at the front door. I inched closer, peeking through the curtain. There they were, Alejandro and the tattooed man. Alejandro tried to play it off, saying he needed to talk, that he'd given me the wrong DVD. That's all. But the man behind him didn't say a word, just stared. You know that look, the kind that cuts right through you? Like he knew exactly where your fear lived? I shouted that I was calling the police, and they started pressing. It'll just take a minute, Alejandro said, trying to keep his voice steady. But the other guy stepped forward and put his hand on the doorknob. That's when I lost it. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, screaming everything I could. Only then did they back off. They said I was overreacting, that it was all just a misunderstanding. When the police arrived, the two of them were still at the end of the street. They tried to run, but they were caught. At the station, the truth came out. Alejandro was part of a ring that distributed illegal recordings. But not just any recordings. He sold real snuff films, custom orders. He hid them among the regular DVDs and used street vendors like me to move the product. When I heard that, my stomach turned to stone. All of that had entered my home, passed through my children's hands. For days, the images from that video played on repeat in my mind, and it didn't stop there. Even with those two locked up, something strange started happening in my house. That's when things got truly terrifying. After the arrests, I thought the worst was over. That with Alejandro and that man behind bars, my family could move on. But I was wrong. So wrong. That same week, my kids started having nightmares. The kind that jolt them awake screaming, drenched in sweat, staring at nothing. My youngest said he saw a man with dark eyes standing at the foot of his bed. My oldest started sleeping with the lights on, and even then he'd wake up crying. I thought it was just trauma, until I started hearing things too. Doors creaking in the middle of the night. Footsteps in the hallway when everyone was asleep. One night I woke up to the sound of the TV on in the living room. When I went downstairs, the screen was blue. No signal, but the DVD, that damn DVD, had been taken out of the drawer and left on top of the player, like someone had tried to watch it again. The feeling of being watched became constant. It didn't matter if I was in the bathroom cooking or sitting with the kids. It was like something was there, pressed up against me, sucking the air out of the room. The energy in the house turned heavy, suffocating. The plants wilted overnight. The neighbor's dog started barking every time it passed my door. I'm not religious, but at that point, I started looking for help. First, I went to church, then tried a priest who wouldn't even listen to the whole story. He told me to hold on to my faith and stay away from evil things. But what did that even mean? Throw away the DVD. It was already wrapped up, hidden, and yet it felt like it was poisoning everything. It was a friend from the market who recommended a shaman, a native elder named Mamerto, who lived in a secluded house in the mountains. When I arrived with my kids, he didn't ask for any explanation. He just looked at me, touched my youngest son's forehead, and said, "Something was brought into your home, something that should never have been seen." He explained that certain objects carry pain, suffering, and death. That kind of energy, when absorbed unwillingly, attracts presences, not just of the victims, but of those who caused the harm. He said the camera that recorded that video had cursed everything it touched, that the real fear captured in it had become a kind of portal, a link between the dead and those who watched. I agreed to the cleansing. It was that, or lose my mind. Mamerto prepared a simple but intense ritual. Incense, prayers in a language I didn't understand, rhythmic drum beats and dried leaves burning in a clay pot. Smoke filled the entire house. During the ritual, my kids fell into a deep sleep, as if sedated. And me, I closed my eyes for a moment and felt a biting cold, like someone had whispered in my ear. I saw flashes, the victim's face from the video, eyes wide with terror, the room where it was filmed, and something behind the camera, something faceless, formless, just a presence thick and dark like living smoke. Mamerto ended the ritual with a sharp cry. After that, the house fell silent, but a different kind of silence, like the air had been purified. The kids slept through the night. So did I. For the first time in weeks without waking up in a panic. The next day, he told me the presence had been driven away, but the memory, that would stay. That some kinds of evil don't wash away with holy water or smoke. They cling to you. But at least now I could move forward. I decided we needed to move, not just because of the fear, but the memories. Every corner of that place reminded me of what had happened, of the night I put that cursed disc into the player. It was hard. But a few months later, we relocated to a quieter neighborhood, farther out, more peaceful. Today, my kids are grown. We still avoid horror movies, even the silly ones. No more bootlegs. I never put an unknown DVD in the player again. In fact, we don't even own a DVD player anymore, just streaming, and even that's iffy. Sometimes when I pass by street markets and see stalls selling sketchy stuff, my stomach twists. I think about how many other families might have brought something into their homes without knowing what they were really getting. Because in the end, you never know what might be hiding in a simple object. A tape, a photo, a toy, or in my case, a nameless, scratched-up disc tossed in the corner of a stall. There are things we weren't meant to see, and when we do, they see us back. Creepy, right? What did you think of the story? From 0 to 10, what score would you give it? Leave your thoughts down below. Some objects seem cursed the very moment they fall into the wrong hands, like the doll you're about to meet. It sat quietly on a dusty shelf in an antique shop, until someone decided to take it home. Some people collect stamps, old coins. I've always been obsessed with things that carry history. Things with dust, rust, the marks of time. I've always felt drawn to what once belonged to someone else. Like every old piece has a memory clinging to it, waiting to be uncovered. It was my way of feeling connected to the past. But that Saturday, I learned not every story should be dug up. It was cold in Salem, one of those biting winds that cuts right through your coat. I was just passing through, enjoying a solo weekend, and as I always do in towns with that old-world energy, I went hunting for hidden antique shops. The dustier, the messier, the better. The real treasures are never in the neat ones. I wandered down some back streets, and there, on a dimly lit corner, I spotted a fogged-up storefront with no name, just a rusted sign hanging crooked on the door. I walked in without hesitation. The smell hit me first. Old wood, dried leather, burnt candle wax. The shop was dark, lit only by a few corner lamps and packed to the ceiling with oddities. Cracked mirrors, pendulum clocks that looked like they'd stopped decades ago. Sepia-toned photos of families long turned to dust. I moved slowly, soaking it all in. That's when I saw her. On a high shelf wedged between an antique radio and a book with a torn leather cover, sat a doll. Not just any doll, one of those Victorian porcelain ones, with light brown hair tied in 2 braids, and the eyes, glass but so lifelike. She had this serious look, like she was bored or waiting for something, or someone. I stared for a long moment. When I climbed onto a stool to reach her, I swear I felt a chill run up my spine. I shrugged it off. Just the cold, I thought. I called over the shopkeeper, a thin man with a distant look in his eyes. When I asked about the doll, he hesitated, said she'd been there for years, that no one wanted her because they said she brought bad luck. He laughed, but it was that uncomfortable kind, like he was trying to hide how uneasy he really was. I smiled and bought her anyway. I've never believed in negative energy. I just thought she had a strong presence. A doll with weight, you know. That night, I placed her on the living room shelf next to some old books and a clock I'd picked up on the trip. Made tea, wrapped myself in a blanket, and put on an old movie. My kind of perfect night. But around 2 a.m., I woke to a sharp noise, a strange thud, like something had fallen. I stumbled into the living room, half asleep. Everything was in place. Almost. The doll wasn't on the shelf anymore. She was lying on the rug, turned toward the hallway, her glass eyes fixed on the door. My heart raced, but I tried to rationalize it. Must have slipped. I picked her up, put her back, and went to bed. But that's when the weird feeling started, the sense that someone was watching me in the dark. That something was standing in the corner of the room, just staring. But when I turned on the light, nothing. dead silence. The next day, I tried to ignore it. But that night was worse. First came the footsteps, light, dragging across the hardwood. Then a muffled giggle, the kind that makes your skin crawl. I bolted upright, ran to the living room. Everything was dark except for the faint glow from the street filtering through the curtains. But what stopped me cold was the shelf, completely ransacked. Books on the floor, objects knocked over. And the doll, again, out of place. This time, sitting on the couch. After that, things spiraled. By the third day, I locked her in a box inside the closet. Still, I heard noises at night. The feeling of being watched only grew stronger. A constant cold crept into my room, even with the heater blasting. Like something was draining the warmth and the peace. I started sleeping badly, having nightmares. Confused dreams of a child standing in the doorway, braids hanging, eyes glowing in the dark. I'd wake up sweating, convinced someone was standing beside my bed. That's when I decided to set up cameras. If it was all in my head, at least I'd know. I positioned one in the living room, pointed right at the shelf, and I waited. The next morning, I reviewed the footage. At first, nothing. Silence. But around 3:27 a.m., I saw it. The doll, still inside the box, move. On its own. First her head turned, then the box lid creaked open, and she slid out. Slowly, like she was gliding. The image was shaky, but I could see it. She made her way to the edge of the shelf and just stood there, staring straight at the camera, like she knew I was watching. That froze my blood. No more pretending it was my imagination. This was real, and it came from something I'd brought into my home. Right then, I grabbed my phone and started searching for help. I didn't even know what to look up. Haunted doll, supernatural presence, cursed object. I ended up finding the name of a paranormal expert, Dr. Josh Malley, an investigator known for dealing with this kind of thing. I scheduled a visit for the next day, and while I waited, I spent the night wide awake, all the lights on, sitting on the couch, the doll locked up again. This time in a sealed box with salt sprinkled around it. I didn't know if it would work, but it was all I could do until the doctor arrived. Only the worst hadn't even started yet. The next morning, Dr. Josh arrived at 9 a.m. sharp. He was calm, soft-spoken, and carried an old leather case filled with objects that looked like they belonged in a horror movie. He greeted me like he already knew what was going on, stepped into the living room, looked around in silence for a few seconds and said, "There's something here that doesn't belong." I led him to the box where the doll was. As he got closer, he made a subtle grimace, like he'd caught a whiff of rotten meat. He said the energy was thick, that the doll carried more than memories. It carried a presence, one that didn't want to leave. He asked to set up what he called a containment circle in the middle of the room, placed candles at specific points, drew symbols on the floor with white chalk, and scattered what looked like cracked crystals. He talked as he worked, more to himself than to me. Said dolls like this, made with certain materials and in certain eras, were used as vessels. That some families in the 19th century used them in rituals to trap the spirits of dead children or worse, to summon entities in exchange for protection. But sometimes, what came through wasn't what they expected. I listened, trying not to panic. With every word, the room seemed to get colder, like the air was thickening. We placed the doll in the center of the circle. That's when things went off the rails. As soon as he started chanting words I didn't recognize, the temperature plummeted. The candle flames flickered. The doll, motionless until then, slowly turned her head, and her glass eyes gleamed like they had a life of their own. Dr. Josh kept going, even as he trembled. I stood frozen, heart in my throat, not sure if I should run or faint. Then the doll laughed. Not a child's giggle. A muffled, raspy sound, half innocent, half demonic. Like two voices at once, it sent chills down to my bones. The room lights flickered, and the floor trembled slightly, like something was trying to break free. Dr. Josh shouted for me to stay inside the circle and started throwing white powder around the doll, which was now writhing on its own. Her braids moved like they were alive, Her dress billowed as if caught in a wind that didn't exist. I didn't know if I was awake or trapped in a nightmare. At the ritual's climax, he pulled out an old dagger, plunged it into the center of the doll, and shouted something in Latin. The sound that came from her then, I'll never forget it. A high-pitched scream, like a child and an animal at once. The candles snuffed out all at once. Dead silence. The doll went still. Her glass eyes shattered, and then everything went black. When the light returned, Dr. Josh was on his knees, covered in cold sweat, breathing hard. The doll, or what was left of her, was in pieces. It looked like she'd been burned from the inside out. The chalk circle was gone, and the air finally felt clean. He looked at me and said firmly, "It's over. Whatever was here is gone. But be careful. Sometimes not everything leaves completely. Some presences like to leave a trace." After he left, I spent the rest of the day cleaning up, trying to convince myself it was all over. And for a while it seemed like it was. The nights were quiet again. No noises, no laughter, no strange movements, nothing out of place, but every now and then, when I'm alone in my room and the house is dead silent, I still feel it. That subtle presence, like someone's watching from a distance. A sudden chill. A whisper that seems to come from the hallway. I learned the hard way that not every old object is just decoration. Some carry stories that should never be retold. Stories that don't want to be forgotten, and they'll do anything to stay alive. How horrifying. When evil takes shape, it's almost impossible to ignore its presence. But sometimes it doesn't live inside an object. It hides in words. Words written in a book that should have never been opened, like in the next story. Some people say ignorance is bliss, but sometimes it's just the last thing keeping you from seeing what you shouldn't. I learned that the hard way on a sweltering afternoon in Mexico City when my eyes landed on a book that should have stayed forgotten. It was just another Saturday. I'd gone out to wander the Sonora market, the one everyone knows for selling everything: herbs, religious icons, folk saints, and some heavier stuff too. It wasn't my first time browsing those aisles. I'd always been into esotericism, occultism, that kind of thing. But I never took it too seriously. For me, it was more curiosity than belief. Still, that day, something in the air felt off. Darker, thicker, and there was this smell, burnt wax mixed with sulfur, that you just couldn't ignore. At the end of one of the rows, between a stall selling colored candles and another stacked with Santa Muerte statues, there was a small table draped in a worn purple cloth. Behind it sat an old man, his eyes sunken and his skin almost translucent, staring at me like he'd known I'd stopped there all along. And I did. Right in the center of the table, as if it had been left there just for me, was a thick book with a dark leather cover, no title on the spine. When I asked the price, the old man locked eyes with me and said in a low voice, "This isn't for just anyone. This book carries a darkness that might not let go of you once it's close." I laughed, awkwardly. Figured it was just part of the act to drive up the price. But he didn't smile, just repeated, "If you take it, don't say you weren't warned." I paid in cash, thanked him, and walked out with the umbral grimoire tucked under my arm. It wasn't until I got home that I noticed the title, barely visible in the embossed cover. The name sent a chill down my spine, but I shrugged it off. I went straight to my room and started flipping through it. The book was written in Old Spanish, filled with strange symbols and circular diagrams. Some pages were handwritten, others looked printed. Most of it talked about rituals, ancient entities, hidden knowledge, and one chapter caught my eye: the invocation of hidden wisdom. The text claimed that with the right ritual, you could summon an entity capable of revealing the world's hidden secrets, things the human mind wasn't meant to grasp. Curiosity got the better of me. I jotted down the ingredients: 3 black candles, a ceramic bowl, coarse salt, and a round mirror. All stuff I could easily get my hands on. I set everything up that same night. I closed the windows, turned off the lights, and drew a circle on the floor with the salt. The candles were placed where they were supposed to be. I sat inside the circle, put the mirror in front of me, and started reciting the incantation. The words were strange, almost guttural, vibrating in my chest as I spoke them. As I read, the temperature dropped suddenly. The candles flickered, even though there wasn't a breeze. A heavy silence filled the room and my body went ice cold. When I reached the last line, the candles snuffed out all at once. I was left in total darkness. I couldn't see a thing, until I realized something was in the mirror. A shadow. A tall, faceless, dark figure standing behind me. I couldn't move. It was like my body had been switched off. I felt like I was being pulled inward, my chest aching as if something was pushing from the inside out. The figure lingered for seconds, or minutes, I don't know, until in a burst of desperation I recited the closing words. The moment I finished, the figure vanished. The candles relit themselves. I fell backward, drenched in cold sweat, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might stop. I told myself it was just a side effect of the ritual, psychological, but I was wrong. The next night, the nightmares started, always the same scene. The mirror, the figure, and me trapped, unable to scream or run. I'd wake up soaked, certain someone was standing at the foot of my bed, watching. Strange things began happening in the house. Lights flickering, objects moving on their own. A sudden, overwhelming smell of mildew out of nowhere. One time I found wet footprints leading out of the bathroom, as if someone had just stepped out of the shower. But I lived alone. I started researching everything I could about the Umbral Grimoire. I found old forums, accounts from people who'd heard of the book, but no one who'd actually used it. In one of those searches, I came across a mention of Father James, an exorcist, living in a small village outside Puebla. I sent him an email. To my surprise, he replied the same day, urging me to bring the book to him as soon as possible. He said the longer that entity stayed close, the harder it would be to drive away. I took a bus the next morning. I carried the book wrapped in cloth, careful not to touch it directly. Father James was a quiet, serious man with a gaze that seemed to cut right through you. The moment he saw the book, he murmured a prayer and asked me to tell him everything. When I finished, all he said was, "This entity doesn't want wisdom, it wants to open a path." He prepared the altar that same night, lit white candles, sprinkled holy water, and drew symbols on the floor. He told me to sit inside a new circle, this one for protection. He began to pray, and slowly the atmosphere shifted. The room seemed to shrink, as if the walls were closing in. The temperature dropped again. The candles trembled. And then it appeared. The same dark figure, but closer now, clearer. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its hatred. It stood there as if sizing up the room. Then it tried to cross the circle where I sat. When it hit the boundary, it let out a shriek like metal scraping against glass. Father James raised his voice in prayer. He threw blessed oil at the figure, which recoiled and began to dissolve, like smoke in a strong wind. The last thing I heard was a whisper in my ear. "This isn't over." The book was burned right then and there. Father James said he couldn't guarantee it was truly gone, but the entity was weakened. I went home still terrified. I slept with the lights on for weeks. Moved soon after. Never went back to Sonora Market. To this day, I stay far away from anything occult. Every now and then, I still feel that presence, like it's waiting for me in some dark corner of the house. And whenever I pass a mirror, I never look for too long, just in case it decides to look back. So bizarre. Supernatural terror can be born out of curiosity, but sometimes it comes after a real tragedy. That's when the unexplained mixes with grief, with pain, and with something that never found rest. Like the next story, which took place at a crowded street fair in Mexico City. But before we move on, if you've made it this far, it means you're enjoying our stories. So leave a like to let YouTube know you love this kind of content and don't want to miss any new horror stories. In the middle of December's chaos, when everyone seems desperate to grab last-minute gifts, my sister and I set up our toy stall at the Mexico City open-air market. It was tradition. Every year we'd stay late, selling dolls, toy cars, stuffed animals, all the things kids love and parents buy just to see a smile. But that year, the air felt different, heavy, It wasn't just the insane gas prices or the protests popping up all over the city. It was like, between the blaring music and the smell of tamales, something didn't belong there. We arrived early that day. The sky was overcast, and the tension in the streets already hinted that the night would be long. People rushed by, some carrying signs, others cursing at the gas station prices next door. Still, the market started filling up, kids laughing, vendors shouting deals, lights flashing from every stall. On the surface, everything seemed normal. We were almost done setting up when the chaos began. A group of protesters came running down the main street chanting, banging pots, setting off fireworks. Then someone shouted something about gunshots, and all hell broke loose. The crowd panicked, scattering in every direction. People tripping, stalls collapsing, kids crying, boxes flying everywhere. I tried to pull my sister under our table, but in the chaos, I saw a little girl in a white dress. She looked about 8, getting shoved into a stack of crates. She fell, tried to get up, but was trampled by the crowd until she disappeared under the chaos. The scene played in my head like slow motion, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't unsee it. By the time things calmed down, the girl wasn't breathing. Her face was bruised, her eyes half open, like she was still watching the chaos around her. Her mother arrived minutes later, screaming in despair, and to this day, the sound of it sends chills down my spine. The market closed after that. They said it was to investigate, but deep down we all knew no one wanted to go back there anytime soon. The tragedy was all anyone talked about for weeks. There was even a mass held at the spot. A cross was put up where her body was found, covered in flowers, toys, and a stuffed bear that quickly got dusty. On New Year's Eve, they decided to reopen the market. The promise was more security, fewer stalls, all the things politicians say to look like they're doing something. My sister and I went back, even though it turned our stomachs. The city needed to keep moving, and we needed to sell. But the vibe, it was off. It started with whispers. Kids saying they'd seen a girl walking between the stalls. Always the same. Pale skin, hair in 2 braids, a white dress, and one side of her face bruised. Some claimed they'd talked to her, that she asked about her parents, that she said she was cold. One kid even said the girl had invited her to play hide and seek, but when she went to look, the girl was gone. At first, I thought it was just kids making up stories, the kind that grow out of shared trauma. But then things got really weird. One night, a toddler under 3 disappeared for a few minutes. His mom freaked out, said she'd turned away for a second, and when she looked back, he was gone. They searched the stalls, the alleys, under tables. When they found him, he was standing near the cross, staring blankly, his clothes torn, like he'd been dragged through the dirt. All he kept saying was, "She wanted to play. She wanted to play with me." After that, WhatsApp audios started circulating, scared parents warning that it wasn't safe to bring little kids to the market at night. One woman swore her son woke up crying with scratches on his arms after they'd been there. Another said his daughter woke up in the middle of the night saying the girl with the broken face was standing by her bed, telling her to leave. The police, as usual, did nothing, called it mass hysteria. But among the vendors, an unspoken rule spread: no little kids allowed. And those who ignored it, well, they dealt with the consequences. Some parents didn't believe it, thought it was all exaggeration, superstition, until the day a woman who ran one of the food stalls came screaming for help. Her son had started crying in the middle of the market, saying someone was pulling his arm. She looked over and swore she saw a small, pale hand gripping his wrist before vanishing into thin air. The boy was left with bruises, like someone had really grabbed him hard. By then, the cross in the middle of the market had become a makeshift shrine. Always fresh flowers, lit candles, and notes. Some asking for forgiveness, others offering toys. A desperate attempt to calm whatever was trapped there. But the truth was, no one knew how to handle it. The energy of the place had shifted. It wasn't just a marketplace anymore. It was a hotspot of tension. A place where everyone glanced over their shoulders, avoided walking near the cross, and spoke in hushed tones, like they were afraid of disturbing something. And that's when I realized the market wasn't just a market anymore. It had become a marked place, A space where death wasn't just an accident, but a presence, something that lingered, that kept walking among the stalls, appearing to children, searching for something even it might not understand. The feeling of being watched was constant. Even on nights when everything seemed calm, you could feel that heavy energy. Like the smiles were forced and the air was thick. The worst part? Even after all that, the market kept running. Because life goes on, right? Bills don't stop coming, and the city, tired of protests and crises, needed any scrap of normalcy it could get. But those of us who went there often, we knew. We knew that girl was still there. That the sound of children's laughter sometimes came from empty spaces. That toys disappeared and reappeared near the cross. That certain eyes kept watching from the crowd. And that's why, to this day, when people ask if it's worth setting up a stall there again at the end of the year, I hesitate. Not for the money, but for the fear that one day, that girl might choose another child to play with. And not everyone comes back from that kind of game. So creepy. What did you think of that story? From 0 to 10, what's your rating? Drop your opinion in the comments. I've never been able to walk into an art gallery again without feeling a chill run down my spine. It all started one weekend, when I decided to visit an auction in an old manor house deep in the Hampshire countryside. The place looked like it had been plucked straight out of a Gothic novel. Arched windows, shadowy hallways, and a grand staircase that groaned under the weight of centuries. The auctioneer was a short elderly man with a cane and a bow tie, who insisted on keeping the curtains drawn, as if daylight might ruin the relics on display. That alone gave the place an eerie vibe. But what drew me there was my obsession with antique art. I've always had a strange fascination with objects that carry history, especially portraits. The weirder, the better. There's something hypnotic about staring into the face of someone painted centuries ago, knowing that in some way, they've survived through time. In the main hall, among broken clocks, stained tapestries, and Victorian dolls with glassy eyes, there was a painting covered in red cloth. When the auctioneer pulled the fabric away, I felt the air shift. A shiver crept up the back of my neck, as if time itself had paused. It was a portrait of a woman, pale skin, dark hair elegantly pinned up, and eyes that, honestly, they looked alive. She wasn't smiling. Her gaze was sad, but there was a simmering fury beneath it, like she'd been betrayed, abandoned, or something worse. The piece was simply titled Lady Ravenscar. Most people looked away or shifted uncomfortably. Some even whispered about the painting's heavy energy. But me? I was frozen. That portrait called to me in a way I can't explain, like it had chosen me. I placed my bid without a second thought. No one else competed. I took it home for a steal. Once I hung the painting in my study, right above the fireplace, the house fell silent. Too silent. That's when I started noticing things. Nothing obvious at first, just that unsettling feeling of being watched. At first, I chalked it up to my imagination. But as I spent more late nights working in that room, her eyes seemed to follow me. No matter where I stood, Lady Ravenscar's gaze was locked on me. A few nights later, I woke to the sound of shattering glass. My heart pounding, I rushed downstairs. The lamp in the study was knocked over, but nothing else seemed out of place, except the painting. It was slightly crooked, as if someone had tried to pull it off the wall. But I lived alone. The next night, the lights started flickering. I thought it was a wiring issue, so I called an electrician. He found nothing wrong. "Perfectly fine," he said. I stayed up late watching, and when I looked back at the painting, I swear her expression had changed. The sadness was still there, but her eyes, wide open, alert, almost defiant. That's when I decided to dig deeper. I searched for Lady Ravenscar in digital archives, old libraries, and historical newspapers. It took time, but I found a record in an obscure book about forgotten English noble families. Lady Judith Ravenscar, 1832. She was said to be a woman of uncommon beauty, married to a cruel baron. Her husband, consumed by jealousy, locked her away for months in a room of their own home, accusing her of an affair with a painter. She died in isolation. And the painter? vanished without a trace. The portrait, according to legend, was his final work, painted in haste, hidden behind drawn curtains and whispered vows of forbidden love. The more I read, the heavier the air in my house became. My dreams started bleeding into reality. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, hearing knocks at my bedroom door. One night, I swore I heard a voice whispering my name. Not just any whisper. It was feminine, melancholic, but thick with rage. At this point, I didn't know if I was losing my mind or if I'd truly brought something into my home. That's when someone recommended I see a medium. I was referred to a woman named Madame Ophelia, a specialist in sacred art and spiritually charged objects. She arrived at my house in the early evening, her expression serious, wearing a necklace of symbols I'd never seen before. The moment she stepped into the study, she stopped and said, "There's something here that doesn't want to leave." All I could do was point to the painting. She didn't hesitate. She pulled candles, stones, and incense from her bag, thick, almost sickly sweet. She told me not to interrupt and began a ritual. It wasn't dramatic, but the air turned ice cold. The candle flames flickered wildly, though there was no breeze. When she spoke the name Judith, every light in the house went out at once. The atmosphere shifted again. The room felt suffocating, and her presence, it's hard to describe. It was like an invisible person was standing right there with us. The medium trembled and sweated, but her voice stayed firm. Suddenly, the painting crashed to the floor. Among the shattered frame, something began to take shape, a dark mist swirling into a human form. I saw it. I saw her face. Just like the portrait, but now Judith had tears in her eyes, her mouth slightly open, as if she wanted to speak but couldn't. Ophelia begged her to find peace, to let go of her anger. And then, as if the world froze for a second, the mist recoiled, spun, and vanished with a sharp crack. The lights flickered back on. The medium collapsed onto the floor, exhausted. The painting? Split down the middle, the paint running from Judith's face as if she'd finally cried for real. Since that night, the house has been normal. No strange noises, no eerie feelings. And me? I've learned never to underestimate the weight an object can carry. No matter how beautiful or valuable it seems, some stories refuse to be forgotten, and some of them won't let you ignore them. I've never bought another portrait. Never again. There are things we only understand after going through something we can't explain. And honestly, after that portrait, it's clear that not all art is just aesthetic. Sometimes it carries a soul along with it. If you stayed with me until now, comment down below, "Cursed Mirror," just so I know you're one of the brave ones who stick around till the end. Oh, and if you like those stories that send chills down your spine, subscribe to the channel. There's always something new coming, and trust me, there's more straight from the shadows on the way. Leave a like too, because we just created a strange connection tonight, and that deserves to be recorded. There's another video right next to this one that keeps the same dark vibe. Click it and keep watching with me, because the darkness never really ends.